Her mother, Ingrid, who had once sewn these small leather pieces purely as a quiet hobby back in her youth, now stood proudly beside her daughter running an actual, thriving business. There was a particular kind of pride in her eyes, the kind only a mother watching her child truly succeed can carry, a pride that no amount of money could have bought. One quiet afternoon, Lena walked down alone to the stream behind the farmhouse, the very same spot that had once run gray and poisoned with chemical waste. The same spot where her father had stood so many times feeling helpless. It was clean now, genuinely clean, the water running clear over smooth stones. The factory had changed its practices entirely, realizing, somewhat ironically, that what they once dismissed as worthless waste had become someone else's gold. Lena stood there for a long while thinking about everything. The years of quiet struggle, the sharp insults, the sleepless nights bent over a sewing machine. And now that same once ruined ground had become the very foundation of her family's new identity. Her little shop wasn't just an online page anymore, and it had grown into a modest but genuine showroom right there in the village. Converted from what used to be an old barn, new customers arrived nearly every week, some driving from towns hours away just to see with their own eyes how one determined young woman had built something real out of her mother's forgotten craft and a factory's carelessly discarded scraps. The very people who once said, with such certainty, that land is finished, now quietly sent their own daughters to learn a trade from her. The ones who once mocked her openly now spoke of her with genuine pride to visitors, saying simply, "She's from our village. You know, this isn't only a story about a business or even about leather and sewing machines. It's a story about patience, about quiet, unshakable stubbornness, and about the simple, powerful truth that what the world so easily calls waste can become someone else's greatest opportunity, as long as you have the vision to actually see it, and the will to build it anyway, even when everyone around you insists it's impossible. Even now, when people ask Lena how she managed to keep going through it all, the loss of her father, the ruined land, the years of ridicule, she just smiles quietly and says, "When the world sees you as garbage, you have to prove your own worth with your own two hands." So that's exactly what I did. Within a few weeks, she had a real collection sitting on the workshop's single wooden shelf. Wallets in various shades of brown and black, small coin purses, two belts she'd attempted almost as a dare to herself. But a new problem loomed now, one that kept her up at night almost as much as the sewing did. Who was actually going to buy them? Her village wasn't exactly a bustling market for handcrafted leather goods. People here counted every euro carefully. They didn't spend money on things that looked extra, things that weren't strictly necessary. A childhood friend, visiting one Sunday, showed her something on her phone. Women across the country selling handmade goods online, building small shops through social media pages, shipping their work to cities she'd never even visited. Lena had an old smartphone with a cracked corner screen and painfully slow rural internet, but it worked mostly. She began spending her nights, after the sewing was done, after her mother had gone to bed, teaching herself everything from scratch. How to set up a simple online shop, how to write a product description that didn't sound clumsy, how to photograph a wallet so it actually looked appealing, instead of like something photographed in a dim farmhouse kitchen. Her makeshift studio was a white bedsheet stretched across the kitchen table, sunlight through the window as her only light source, angle after angle, shot after shot, deleting most of them, until something finally looked halfway professional. Eventually, nervously, she launched her tiny online shop. The very first item she listed was a simple brown leather wallet, her mother's stitching technique running through every seam, Lena's own newly trained hands doing the cutting and finishing, and a story neither of them had spoken publicly about yet. For days afterward, nothing happened. No orders, no messages, just silence and a phone she checked far too often, sometimes a dozen times an hour, her heart sinking a little more each time the screen showed nothing new. Then, one quiet evening while she was washing dishes and trying not to think about it, a notification appeared. New order received. Lena's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone into the sink. Her mother came rushing in from the sitting room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Was its loss?" "What happened? What's wrong?" Lena turned the phone toward her, eyes already welling up. "Mama, we got our first order. Someone actually bought one." That night, in that tiny back room with its two mismatched sewing machines, Surrounded by a village full of people who doubted her at every turn, something had truly, quietly begun. But Lena had absolutely no idea just how far it was about to go. One single order was about to become an entire business, and Lena had no idea just how far it was going to carry her family. The first buyer was a woman from Frankfurt who had ordered that plain brown leather wallet. Lena packaged it with almost obsessive care, wrapping it in brown paper, adding a small handwritten note that simply said, "Thank you for trusting my work, Lena." She had to travel nearly 2 hours by bus to reach the nearest proper shipping center. Since her village didn't even have its own courier office, it didn't matter to her at all. She made that entire trip with a smile she hadn't worn in months, maybe longer. Days later, the review appeared on her shop page. Beautiful handmade wallet. Real leather. Incredible craftsmanship. You won't find quality like this anywhere for the price. Lena read those words over and over that evening, sitting on the porch steps as the sun went down, like she'd stumbled onto buried treasure in her own backyard. From there, things started to move slowly at first and then faster than she could have imagined. A second order arrived within a week. Then a third, a fourth. People weren't just buying a wallet. They were buying something original, something with a story behind it. Not another mass-produced item pulled off a factory conveyor belt, but something with tiny, honest imperfections that proved a human hand had shaped it, stitch by careful stitch. Buyers started posting short unboxing videos online, tagging their friends, writing captions like, "Look at this, a young woman in a tiny German village makes these entirely by hand." Some of them dug deeper and found the fuller story, how she'd pulled the very leather from a factory's waste pile behind her family's farm, how she'd learned the craft from her mother's half-forgotten skill, how she'd built all of this from nothing after losing her father and very nearly losing the land itself. That story struck a chord with people in a way Lena never expected. Orders climbed steadily, 5 or 6 a week at first, then 15. Then by autumn, well over 100 a month, more than she and her mother could have ever imagined sitting in that dusty back room. But 2 sewing machines simply couldn't keep pace anymore. Lena and Ingrid worked deep into the night, hunched over needle and thread until 1 or 2 in the morning, eyes heavy, fingers aching and calloused, backs sore from hours bent over the same worn wooden table. But something inside both of them refused to stop, refused to slow down, even when exhaustion pulled at every part of their bodies. Lena made a decision that terrified her a little. It was time to grow properly this time. She gathered every euro she'd carefully saved and bought 3 additional sewing machines from a supplier in Frankfurt, along with proper leather-cutting tools that made the work faster and cleaner. It was a genuine risk. If the orders slowed down even slightly, that money would simply be gone, along with months of savings. But she trusted deeply what she and her mother had already built together with almost nothing. Now she needed hands to help. There were women and young girls scattered around the village with real sewing skill, women who had simply never had the opportunity or the encouragement to put that skill to real use. Lena invited them in one by one and trained each of them herself. The same patient way her mother had once trained her, how to cut the leather cleanly along the grain, how to stitch it tightly without cracking it, how to finish the edges so the final product looked genuinely professional. Just 3 girls showed up at first, hesitant, unsure. Lena taught them everything with endless patience, never once losing her temper when their early stitches came out crooked, remembering exactly how her own first wallet had looked. And here is where the story takes its sharpest, most powerful turn. The very same people who once mocked her openly, who used to say things like, "What is she going to make out of garbage?" began quietly sending their own daughters to learn from her. One particular woman, who had once whispered cruel comments at the village bakery while pretending Lena couldn't hear, showed up one afternoon at the workshop door with her teenage daughter standing beside her, looking nervous. "Please," the woman said, her voice much softer than Lena remembered it. "Teach her too. She wants to build something of her own someday." Lena never brought up the past, never mentioned the whispers or the laughter. She simply welcomed the girl inside and started teaching, exactly as she would have wanted to be treated. That was, without question, the most powerful moment in this entire story. The same people who once looked down on her now stood at her door hoping for a chance, hoping their daughters could learn what she had built out of nothing. Lena never once mocked anyone the way she herself had once been mocked. She simply taught everyone who genuinely wanted to learn, patiently, without judgment, the factory's waste, the very thing that had once nearly destroyed her family's land, the very thing her father had spent his last years fighting against, had quietly become the foundation of an entire local livelihood for a dozen families. Even the factory itself eventually took notice. One afternoon, the plant's operations manager drove out to the farmhouse himself, clearly expecting to hear a formal complaint about something. Instead, he offered, somewhat sheepishly, to formally supply her workshop with usable leather scraps at a fair agreed rate, as long as she kept doing exactly what she was doing. Lena agreed with a quiet, satisfied smile. What was once dumped carelessly into a stream for free had now become a proper, reliable supply line for her growing business. Months passed steadily. That tiny back room, once cluttered with broken furniture and old tools, had transformed into a genuine workshop. 7 sewing machines humming along in rows, more than a dozen local women working side by side, laughing, teaching each other, orders arriving steadily from cities all across Germany, and eventually curious inquiries even from neighboring countries. The night the water turned black, she thought she'd lost everything. But that black water was about to make her rich. Listen closely, because this story isn't just about leather and money. It's for anyone the world has ever written off. Anyone told they were finished before they even started. Anyone who's ever stood in front of something broken and been told, just walk away. This is the story of Lena Hoffmann. She lived on the edge of a small village outside Offenbach, in the state of Hesse, Germany, a region that decades ago was known for its tanneries and leather workshops, back when the trade still meant something to the people who lived there. Not far from her family's farmland stood a large leather factory, one of the last big ones still running in the area. Big machines, big trucks rolling in and out every morning before sunrise. Big money, at least for the people who owned it. But for years, quietly, without anyone ever really stopping it, that factory dumped its waste into the stream that cut straight through Lena's family land. Chemical runoff that turned the water a dull gray-brown, scraps of tanned hide that piled up along the banks and rotted in the sun, a smell that clung to the soil no matter how much rain fell. This had been going on since before Lena was even born, a slow poison seeping into ground her grandfather once farmed. Her father fought it for years. He wrote letters to the local council. He requested meetings with the factory's management. He even drove 2 hours to the regional environmental office once, sat in a waiting room for 4 hours, only to be told the matter was under review. The factory had lawyers. The factory had money. The factory had connections in the town hall that a small farmer never could. Lena's father had a modest piece of land, a stubborn heart, and a daughter who watched him grow more tired every year. Then one winter, he passed away. Heart failure, the doctor said, though Lena always believed exhaustion played its part too. And just like that, barely into her 20s, she was left alone with her mother, a farmhouse that needed constant repair, and a stretch of land that could barely grow a decent crop of potatoes anymore. The neighbors talked, the way neighbors always do in small villages where everyone knows everyone's business before they even know it themselves. That land is finished, they said over coffee. She's just a girl. What is she supposed to do against a whole company? One aunt, visiting for her father's memorial, pulled Lena's mother aside and said plainly, she should find a husband and forget about that ruined field. No good will come from fighting people with that much money. People love deciding what's finished before it's even had a real chance to begin. But Lena wasn't built that way. She had her father's stubbornness running through her, maybe even more of it than he had. Every single morning, rain or shine, she walked down to the stream behind the farmhouse just to see how much new waste had washed up overnight. It became a kind of ritual, equal parts grief and defiance. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe just proof that the fight her father died fighting hadn't been for nothing. One gray, damp morning in early spring, out of pure frustration more than anything else, she crouched down and picked up a scrap of leather from the pile near the water's edge. She almost threw it back without even looking properly. But something made her stop. It wasn't rotten. It wasn't ruined. It was a reject piece, The factory tossed out anything too small, slightly marked, or oddly shaped for their large production runs. But this piece in her hand was thick, supple, Genuinely good quality leather. Real leather. Discarded like garbage because it didn't fit neatly into a machine's cutting pattern. She turned it over in her hands, and something stirred in her memory. Something old, half forgotten, tucked away from childhood. Her mother, Ingrid, long before she married and settled into farm life, used to sew small leather goods by hand back in her own village near the Bavarian border. Little pouches, simple coin purses, sometimes belts for neighbors who couldn't afford the shops in town. That skill had been packed away for over 25 years, buried under marriage, farm work, raising 2 children, and burying one of them far too young. But a skill like that doesn't disappear. It just waits quietly, the way seeds wait underground through a long winter. Lena walked straight into the kitchen, still in her muddy boots, and dropped the scrap of leather on the wooden table in front of her mother. "Mama," she said, "look at this. The factory just throws this away. Can we do something with it?" Ingrid set down the potato she was peeling and picked up the leather slowly, almost cautiously, turning it over in her weathered hands. She ran her thumb across the grain the way someone might greet an old friend they hadn't seen in decades. Her eyes went somewhere far away for a moment. "This is good leather," she said quietly, almost to herself. "This is a waste. A real waste." That was the moment everything changed. Neither of them knew it yet, but that scrap of discarded leather on a farmhouse kitchen table was about to rewrite both their lives. Lena wasted no time. She cleared out a small storage room at the back of the farmhouse, barely larger than a shed, cluttered with old tools and broken furniture, and declared it a workshop. There was no money for anything fancy, no proper equipment, no business plan written on paper. She simply climbed up to the attic and brought down her mother's old sewing machine, its metal body dusty and stiff from disuse, and bought one more, second-hand, from a flea market 2 towns over, paying for it with money she'd saved from selling eggs at the local market. 2 machines. That was the entire operation. No investors, no loans, no safety net. Every single day after that, Lena went down to the stream and gathered whatever usable leather she could salvage from the factory's waste, sorting the pieces by size and quality, scrubbing away the grime, trimming the damaged edges with a pair of old kitchen scissors until she could afford proper leather-cutting tools. Her mother taught her everything piece by piece patiently, the way you teach someone something you love. "Hold the needle at this angle, Lena. Don't pull the thread too tight. The leather will crack if you're not careful. Feel the grain before you cut. It will tell you which way it wants to bend." Every day brought a new lesson. Every evening ended with sore fingers and small victories. The first wallet Lena ever completed wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. The stitching wavered in places. One seam ran slightly crooked, noticeable if you looked closely enough. But when she held that finished wallet in her hands, when her mother smiled at her and said, "Gut rematch, Lena, well done," every long, aching night suddenly felt worth it 100 times over. Word got around the village fast, the way it always does in places where there's little else to talk about. And with the news came the laughter, sharp and unkind. "She's making purses out of the factory's trash? Who on earth is going to buy that?" Some of the older women whispered it at the bakery, while pretending not to notice Lena standing 3 feet away in line. One neighbor, a man who'd known her father for 30 years, told her flatly one afternoon, "Better to take a cleaning job in town than waste your time on this nonsense." Girl. Lena didn't argue with any of them. She simply kept working, kept salvaging, kept stitching late into the night by lamplight when the electricity bill made her nervous about running the overhead lights. She knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep and unshakable, that what was forming under her hands was real. Handmade, original. Every wallet, every small pouch carried her mother's decades-old technique and her own stubborn, self-taught determination sewn into every single seam.